Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us at this session. My name is Shraddha Kothari. I work with the Livelihoods and Gender team at Intellicap, and I will be the moderator for this session. The African continent is home to a wide range of natural resources and biodiversity. However, the increasing pressures of human activity are endangering this rich biodiversity. It is estimated that the overexploitation and degradation of the biodiversity ecosystems will result in a loss of nearly half of Africa's bird and mammal species alone. It is also anticipated that 20 to 30% of lake productivity will decline by the end of the century. This loss of biodiversity that has a detrimental impact on water supply, food security, resilience to extreme events, but it also has an impact on livelihoods, and especially for people living in rural areas. Furthermore, the high incidence of poverty and limited employment opportunities are accelerating the threats to natural resources and biodiversity in Africa. To conserve these natural resources and biodiversity, there are various stakeholders that have implemented programs across Africa. These programs not only focus on conserving natural resources, but also enhance or improve livelihoods in Africa. This session aims to showcase some of the successful models and interventions that have been able to not only improve livelihoods, but also conservation in Africa. Understand the support needs of these models, and finally discuss bottlenecks that are faced by various stakeholders in scaling these models. Before we jump into the session, I would like to go over a few housekeeping rules. I would request all participants to kindly keep themselves on mute. If you do have questions or comments, please share them with us through the chat window. You can also send your questions directly to my colleague Justin via chat. If you do wish to engage with any of the panelists individually, you will be able to schedule one-on-one meetings with them using Brella after the session. You can reach out to them. I have a stellar panel for you today, and I'd like to introduce you now to them. Our first panelist today is Joseph Oriol. He is the managing partner at Okavango Capital Partners. His work focuses on creating and deploying capital structures in conservation enterprises. He has significant investment experience in conservation through investments in wildlife, tourism, forestry, and carbon. Our next panelist today is Lucy Warangi. She is the executive director of the African Conservation Center. The African Conservation Center has more than 3 decades of experience in applied conservation research and developing local community capacity building solutions in conservation. Lucy is also the current chair and founder member of the Conservation Alliance of Kenya, and she sits at the board of various national and international organizations related to conservation. Our next speaker today is Paul Thiangu. He is the program manager at the Greenbelt Movement. His work focuses on empowering communities and promoting sustainable livelihoods through nature-based solutions and sustainable land management. Our next panelist today is an avid social entrepreneur who believes in using enterprise to improve livelihoods. Esther Mutuma is the managing director at Kumaza Forestry Limited. Kumaza is a social enterprise based in Kenya. Previously, she served as the CEO of Asante Capital. Our final panelist for today is Jeff Warden. He's the Conservation Impact Director at WWF International in Africa. Previously, he's worked with Northern Rangeland Trusts and has been instrumental in developing peace, security, and environmental conservation solutions in Northern Kenya. We've budgeted about 60 minutes for our panel discussion today, and after that, we'll move to the Q&A session. I will now turn this over to Joseph. Joseph, we'd like to start with you. It would be great if you could tell us a little bit more about Okavango Capital's work and highlight 1 or 2 key investments that have enabled both conservation and improved livelihoods. Joseph, over to you.
Thank you so much, Shadra. We founded Okavango basically trying to address an issue that stemmed from 3 dynamics in the continent, some of which I think are pretty obvious today. They weren't a few years ago. One is the effects of climate change and how it's getting worse. So addressing that challenge that's taking over the continent, both through deforestation, So trying to mitigate that effect, and then the effects that it will have on very fragile livelihoods, particularly rural Africans. 600 million people are dependent on natural capital today for their livelihoods, and helping them adapt, very important. The second one, obviously, was the massive growth in the continent, both from an economic perspective and from a population perspective. Those growth patterns are not necessarily bad in themselves. They're very positive, but they can be highly unsustainable if not managed properly. And they come with a host of challenges around need for food security, demand for increased protein, you name it. And of course, the third one, which is an effect of those two, is a massive element of habitat loss and biodiversity loss. The estimate is that an area the size of Kenya, so these are FAO figures, the size of Kenya or Botswana or France, for those connecting internationally, is going to be converted from wildlife area to intensive agriculture in the next 15 years in Africa. And what area is converted and why, when we have such low productivity, so poor yields, is something that we need to address. And ultimately, the way we look at it as Okavango is this is it's a capital allocation model. Natural capital has been historically mispriced. We know it's valuable. We don't know how to price it, and that means we've underinvested in it, and that means people who are damaging the environment in Africa are doing so due to poverty-related activities. So investment is key. Now, what does that mean for us? Well, we were set out with the intention to address those problems by investing capital. And that means investing in businesses that have positive outcomes for climate, for nature conservation, and for rural livelihoods. Two examples. Let me give you one of which I get probably a source of smiles on a weekly basis. It's Biocarbon Partners in Zambia. It's a business that was started with very limited ambition of financial gain, but a huge ambition of impact. It's basically a business that manages and sells carbon offsets from the RED standard. RED stands for reduction of emissions from deforestation and degradation, and it's basically a type of carbon offsets that are issued for those people who are protecting existing valuable trees or ecosystems. Hopefully we'll get grass carbon quite soon. This project does so, this activity in partnership with local communities in Zambia. The administrative unit are local chiefdoms. So the company goes, talks to the local chiefdoms, gets buy-in from the communities, and leases, takes long-term management agreements on parts of very important ecosystem. This is savanna forest, part of it is Miombo, part of it is Mopani, part of it is riverine, very diverse ecosystem, habitat to some of the largest remaining populations of the main charismatic fauna in the continent. Basically, we protect the land, make investments in infrastructure and security, and then get the carbon verified, issued, and sold to large multinationals that want to clean their act. They're not able to reduce their emissions quick enough, so they're buying offsets from us. And these offsets come with a massive amount of good to them, right? So the lion's share of the revenue after costs goes to the community, and that money is managed by community resource boards who decide what they invest their money on. In the last year, we've distributed 50 million kwacha. It's around $2 and a bit million, and we're planning to do the same in the next year. It's a really exciting thing to see. These are families in the areas where we work, where according to our studies, the average monthly income per family is $20. Right, so very, very poor. Most of the cash derives from illegal fishing or illegal charcoal burning. Most of the protein comes from illegal hunting activities or illegal fishing, and this can have a massive effect. So it's a company that now protects 1 million hectares. So that's to give you some sense of the size. It's an area the size of Yellowstone Park in the US. Very large, 10,000 square kilometers, right? Imagine a square of 100 kilometers by 100 kilometers. So yeah, I think that's a pretty positive example. It's, by the way, a profitable business today. So it's always nice that it's not just the impact is also a business. There's some things that have accelerated that, and we can talk about it later. And just, I know I'm taking a lot of time, so I'll do a very brief reference to another project that was driven by a partner of mine, which is a company in tourism that pioneered partnerships with pastoralist communities. It's called Porini Game Watchers, and my partner Davinder made the investment. And it's basically again a tourism business that engages long term with communities, takes leaseholds with individual family members, and then provides fixed lease plus a share of revenue from all tourism activities. And they've seen a phenomenal increase in wildlife populations, and they have very good buy-in from the partners. Thank you.
Thank you, Joseph, for sharing that. They're two very different examples of the work that you're doing. I would now like to turn this question over to Lucy. Lucy, African Conservation Center has worked in Kenya for over 3 decades now. And, when we spoke, you told me about the various different projects that you've worked on. It would be great if you could highlight a model that has been successful in doing both, improving livelihoods and conservation in Kenya. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And good afternoon, everyone. African Conservation Center, as she said, has been around for many years, registered as a local NGO with conservation projects largely in Kenya, but in recent years also in East Africa. And our work is around 3 pillars. One is conservation research, looking at applied research that helps us understand the landscape, the wildlife, and the people. And using the knowledge from that research to create programs that have positive conservation outcomes and positive livelihood opportunities for the local community. And we found, as everyone now knows, conservation excluding local communities cannot succeed because they've lived off the land anyway. But the challenges, some of which Joseph has outlined, are common also in East Africa, of changing land use, fragmentation of habitats, degradation of landscapes, and therefore largely decreasing the productivity of those landscapes, both for wildlife and for livestock. And the reason I'm mentioning livestock here is because the conservation areas we focus on are inhabited by the pastoral communities whose main life stay is around livestock. And the patterns of livestock's utilization of land are very similar to wildlife's utilization of land. So the win-win sort of philosophical approach here is that what's good for livestock is good for wildlife. So the land managed well will not only benefit livestock for their own sake in terms of the local community, but will be a great added value to conservation. So ACC has looked at approaches that are beyond the science and the research in terms of interventions that have a nature positive outcome, but also have a livelihood positive outcome. Because having capacity of local communities having capacity to conserve when they're still in the lower marginal poverty range is not sustainable. And if I can highlight just one program that we have been working on in the southern part of Kenya around Amboseli, and there have been several, some on tourism, but I want to mention one that has looked at land degradation as a core threat and trying to look at ways of improving the health of the land and connect that with viable enterprises that are of benefit to the community. So in the group ranches that we've been working with, these are areas that have had communal group ranch management. We've identified groups of women and also identified cultural practices on how these communities manage land, which includes one, mobility in being able to move from place to place, and therefore you didn't overgraze an area, but two, that the seasons were predictable. And we know with changing climate, that is not the case anymore, but also with sedentarization, with more of them becoming sedentary and not being as mobile, you're having less livestock herds moving around less areas, and therefore degradation has intensified. So we have projects where we've brought in rangeland restoration interventions that enable them to restore the degraded landscape. And there's a variety of tools and methods we've used that we can discuss later. And then based on the fact that they would always set aside dry season grazing areas as refuges where they would go to in extreme drought, use the same framework to create those dry season larger areas, which they call olopololi, or you might want to call the smaller ones grass seed banks, like having a bank of seeds of grass that you will come to when it's dry. They've been able to maintain their milking heifers and their calves in better condition. We've then organized the women into enterprises that enable them to sell the milk from the milking heifers that they are keeping on that improved pasture. We have formed the women into a cooperative to be able to create a governance framework through which they would run their milk business. And then we've linked them with a milk cooperative company that would buy the milk from them, and thus cutting out the middleman who would make the profits to them much less. And so trying to look at that whole livestock milk value chain. On the other hand, we've engaged the men in bringing in improved cattle breeds that would then enable them to keep fewer cattle and better breeds that would fetch them more value. So it may look like a disconnect in thinking, what has livestock business got to do with conservation business? But you realize that if they cannot secure their futures, then also the future of conservation is not secure. So we have found a lot of traction because the method is similar to what they've always done culturally, but in this modified setting. But they've not had the linkages to market that enable them to sell their products to a better value. That's still an area that needs a lot of work, but the business model around it has been well received in the pilot areas that we have begun. And I'll be happy to give some more details later, but that's the one project that I would highlight that looks at conserving in a manner that ensures not only livelihoods are improved, but you're creating sustainability around that, that's not dependent on donor funding. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lucy. That was really, really interesting to hear about. I would now turn this question over to Paul. Paul, it would be great to hear about Greenbelt movement's work around supporting both conservation and livelihoods. So if you could take one of your favorite examples and tell us about it, would be great.
Thank you very much. The Greenbelt movement for a long time has been involved in conservation work. Our work majorly revolves around the communities and the resources that they ideally depend on. Over 42 years, we've been planting trees with communities, and we have a network of over 4,000 community groups. These are registered groups and networks in the villages, where each group represents a village, like 5 households. And in many of our projects, the mission and the vision and the objectives is to first conserve the environment, but again looking at their livelihoods, because they depend on these resources for their livelihoods, especially forests, land, and water. And our approach is informed from the ground. We do a lot of needs assessments to identify the needs from the ground. And again, those solutions originate from the communities themselves, so that as we embark on our initiatives and our interventions, the community can really relate with the problems they have and the solutions that we are offering. One particular project that we've been involved in, we were working with 7,000 coffee farmers. These coffee farmers depend on coffee for their livelihoods, but again, we realize there's a lot of land degradation around coffee farming, including use of chemicals, soil erosion, riparian land encroachment, and therefore we engage these farmers through a sustainable land management system. Each farmer had to do a land use plan. We went and mapped their farms to be able to identify what works well for what part of the land. In the process, we were able to take them through certification through international bodies that do certification, and these farmers were able to sell their coffee as premium coffee. And this is because of the fact that the coffee that they produce is also related to a lot of things that they had done in their farm. They have conserved their soil, they have planted bamboo along rivers, and have removed most of the eucalypt trees along rivers. Many of them have done cover crops. All those interventions qualified them to be certified for to sell their coffee as premium coffee. Again, we came along to offer incentives and rewards as went along for those people who had excelled probably in tree planting. Again, we introduced beekeeping. So anyone who didn't have trees also opted to plant more to access these rewards. We offered goats for those who had done fodder crops, cover crops. These are things that are relating to what they are doing in conservation, but again, we are introducing a reward to enable them move forward. We also involve them in water monitoring, very simple techniques, community water monitoring, where these communities were involved in collecting water from the streams that they use. And then we went and took the water into very simple testings in their local polytechnic. You know, in the villages, there are those vocational training institutes, and they were able to incubate that water, and we were able to determine at what level the water safety is. And years later, after our conservation work with the communities, we are able again to collect the same water, and it was very exciting to see the changes in levels of E. coli in the same water that they were using, and that was greatly related to the conservation work that the communities were already doing, and this has motivated them into engaging with us in rehabilitation of forests where the water is coming from. So that is one notable project that I can highlight. But again, we are mostly dealing with the tree planting, mass tree planting in the forest, where after the communities provide the trees, but there's a whole process of going through that, because we start with the mobilization, training them. We have an excessive and very comprehensive training program for the communities, so that they are able to nurture their seedlings. And by the time we plant the trees and we're able to compensate them, we're able to follow up with more training, so that the money that they generate from the trees that they grow, they're able to plow back into their families and initiate more nature-based solutions on their farm. For such places, we again introduce trainings just to build their resilience against climate change. If you have a house, we encourage you to do water harvesting, and then we provide some of the basic tools. For instance, if you are to qualify for a water pan or a tank, you must show that you have already developed your house in a manner that you are able to collect the water through your use of gutters. There's a lot of cost sharing of materials that the communities, to be able to sustain this program, they're able to produce something or to offer something in the process. But again, we are also supporting them at a much higher level. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Jeff, over to you. It would be great if you can share an example of an intervention that's been successful to do both conservation and improve livelihoods.
Right, Shradha, thank you very much. And great to hear all these examples from the panelists. And great to see everybody here today. Thank you for the opportunity. as was mentioned at the beginning, I work with WWF International, with the regional office for Africa based here in Nairobi. And WWF has been active on the continent for 60 years, actually. This is our 60-year anniversary, and working across 14 countries at the moment. But throughout that process, but more intensively, more recently, of course, community and livelihoods have been central to the work that we do around conservation. I think, as you're hearing from all the other panelists as well, community livelihoods, human well-being, these are absolutely critical elements to conservation success across habitats, whether we're talking about forests and coffee, whether we're talking about miombo, whether we're talking about savannas in East Africa. We're hearing some great examples of this. And WWF as an organization, through our country offices, we have a whole number of examples where we're working with communities on the ground, whether it's sort of around octopus fisheries and closures, or vanilla value chains, similar to the one that Paul, you're talking about in terms of increasing value around coffee. How can we do that around sort of conversion-free vanilla, or what that might look like in Congo Basin in terms of community forestry, or even here in Tanzania, where we're looking at sort of high-value harvesting of high-value wood species for the music industry. How do you do that sustainably, and how do you work with communities to ensure that that value is accruing to the people that are protecting these resources? So, I mean, there's a number of examples, and I think the ones you're hearing from these panelists are fantastic examples of how we can work very closely with communities to ensure that there are livelihood benefits and conservation benefits accruing. But we also work at different levels, and I think Lucy alluded to this as well. We work not just with communities, but we work across landscapes. We work with governments as well, and we work across the region as a whole. And so how can we think about scaling up some of these activities? And so this is a lot of what we at the regional office are thinking about as well. How do we take lessons and learnings from different examples, like we're hearing excellent examples of today? How do we think about scaling those, transferring some of those ideas across boundaries? How do you actually take these ideas and sort of develop them within particular local contexts? How do you develop the enabling policy environments to ensure that we have sort of tenure, proper land tenure rights, and the rights of communities over their natural resources, and the ability to manage and benefit from those natural resources are in place? So I think these are all kind of critical elements of how we at WWF, but I think, again, all of the panelists here, these are some of the challenges and opportunities that everyone is trying to address when we look at this question of how we link community benefits and livelihoods with conservation. I think the other point I would add in here then as well is how do we start going beyond the immediate local communities that are custodians of these critical natural resources? And I think that is the essential starting point. The people that live with these resources, and also shoulder the burdens and the challenges associated with maintaining these resources. I mean, those are the first line sort of critical beneficiaries and owners of these resources. But we all, whether we're urban dwellers in Nairobi, whether we live in Europe, we all have a role to play in this as well, because our consumption patterns, the decisions we take daily also have an influence on this. And so another critical thing that we see here is, how do we make conservation more inclusive? How do we ensure that communities are engaged at the very local level? But then how do we engage society more generally across the region, across the continent? How do we bring our youth into this? How do we bring private sector into this more effectively? How do we bring governments? And this was alluded to earlier as well. How do we really recognize the importance of natural capital and the value that natural capital brings? How do we build that into our accounting systems at a government level, so that we can provide the necessary support and investment to ensure that these critical resources are maintained, not just for now, but for all of us in the future? I mean, I think, Joseph, you mentioned 600 million people depending directly on natural resources for their livelihoods, but essentially all of us depend on it, don't we? I mean, there's direct beneficiaries, but then every single one of us are depending on these critical resources. And I think that's another really important part of this equation. How do we recognize that all of our lives, all of our livelihoods depend on these resources? And so we all have a part to play in this. So it's about developing those mechanisms, models, income streams, opportunities at a very local level, but ensuring that those are sort of sustainable through policy environment, and then bringing a much broader group of people together to bear on this as well. And they're the decisions as consumers every day, buying that coffee that has been certified as being sustainable. That's the kind of impacts that we're seeking as well. So, rather than focus on one model, because I think we're hearing so many really great examples here, I mean, I'd like to challenge us all to think as well about this broader sort of ecosystem of engagement that we need to be supporting to ensure that we are strengthening livelihoods at the local scale.
Thank you so much, Jeff. That was quite a perspective, and it really helps broaden our horizon when we're looking at this, and not just looking at the community level, but taking it a step forward. Before we move on to the next discussion, I would like Esther to do a brief about how is her work at Komaza creating impact for both livelihoods and conservation. Esther, over to you.
Thank you, Shraddha. Hi, everyone. So Komaza, we are working with smallholder farmers, and just like Paul and others and Joseph, the real issue for us was the poverty levels when we got started with the communities we were working with, and the underutilization of land. Of course, thinking about the numbers in terms of macroeconomic growth and the rising demand for wood products in the region and in Africa. And the model for us was to introduce livelihood projects and through the agroforestry model to encourage people to utilize, the rural farmers to utilize their land. That would definitely benefit the environment, be a conservation in itself, but most importantly, be a sustainable source of wood products. In this country, those who know the history, there's been a lot of issues around forest degradation. The Mau and other natural forests have suffered over the years. And so for us, stepping in the gap of saying, can we supply sustainable wood to the market? Because the population growth numbers are going to carry on. There's nothing stopping that. And unless someone steps in and does this sustainably, then we're just going to keep seeing the problems that we see. We started out in the coast region, and already we can see an impact of our work, because instead of people using mangroves like they did in the past for their building structures, now they can buy the poles that we produce and use them for construction. And so we are very excited to be expanding the work we are doing within Kenya, but also planning to get across borders into other areas. And to your point again, Jeff, unless these things can be scaled up, then impact is never really impact unless there's a huge scale and ability to scale the programs and replicate the models that are being carried out in one place. So that's what we are doing with Komaza, 25,000 farmers, 10 plus years down the line, hoping to grow into the region and sustainably supply wood into the continent. Thank you, Shraddha.
Thank you so much, Esther. So that takes us to our next discussion. We've talked about your models. Would like to hear about what are key financing mechanisms that would help. Esther, this question is to you. Which is a key financing mechanism that you see will play a more critical role in scaling models like yourselves?
Yeah, it's been a great challenge with the forestry, because most people do not want to wait a long time. Once they make an investment, they want the money out as fast as they can get it out. And we all know trees take a long time to grow. So for us, we were successful in doing a recent fundraise that went well. But after a lot of convincing social impact investors that we've got to do this, it will pay. We've got to exercise some patience and wait for the trees that we plant. But also we were able to try and demonstrate using a brownfield models that is value in the whole investment in the first place. And I guess that was the change maker, in the sense that the minute investors are able to see pilot projects of what can be done with brownfield projects, where you're working with the same rural farmers that planted trees in other parts of the country that are now sitting there as stranded assets, or they're getting misused by brokers and cartels, and the farmer doesn't get a good value for money. Once we were able to demonstrate that we can step in and do direct relationship with the farmer, get the farmer to benefit, investors were willing to listen to us. So it's tough. It's a very tough conversation to have, but it's definitely worth the effort that goes into making financing for these kinds of projects work.
Thank you, Esther. I saw some of the other panelists smiling, so I'm going to first go to Joseph. Joseph, you're at the other end of the spectrum where you're having that conversation. So based on your experience, which financing mechanisms do you say playing a more critical role when it comes to natural resource management and livelihoods?
At the risk of saying something that doesn't make much sense, I think there's room for almost every instrument out there. The main problem that conservation related businesses have had is a misuse of instruments. So you've seen debt taking equity risk, equity investors wanting to be at the top of the queue. You've had grants used as if they were investment and sort of mislabeled and poorly invested and managed. So when you look at what mechanisms or what instruments work best, I would say just being able to allocate the right capital for the right purpose is where you start. Ultimately, the most important one is equity, though, because equity is there to stay. Equity is taking the risk. Equity is the ultimate sign of partnership. So if you are an equity holder with entrepreneurs, you're riding the wave with them, and you might have a fantastic wave or you can get smashed, but you're taking the risk, right? So it's an important part. Now, if you're looking at the terms, investors like us are constrained, right? We have investors ourselves who want to get their money out from our vehicles a lot of the times. In that case, you just have to match timing of investment and exit, and I think people just need to be upfront. One tool that is now becoming incredibly valuable, and I think the sophistication level in the market has gone through the roof in the last half decade. In our area, it was starting to be there, but I would say mostly in emerging markets, now mostly in impact and increasingly in conservation finance, is the use of blended finance structures, because they can allocate desired outcomes for different investor profiles in a way that people who want just impact can subsidize those that want return or need return because actually they have a mandate. And those components can really strengthen the case and the ability to build a successful business.
So Joseph, thank you for sharing that. We're also already seeing questions for the panelists in the chat box. Do keep your questions coming. We will get to them once we're done with the panel discussion, but I will move on to the next discussion area now. Lucy, over to you. You've worked with different interventions over a period of 3 decades. What mechanisms do you think have been effective in enabling community solutions to scale in Kenya when they focus both on conservation and livelihoods?
Sorry, my mic was off. Thank you.
Right.
The scaling aspect is one that has eluded most initial conservation project designs, because when conservation in the continent moved from just being about experts flying in to try and figure out how to save which species and which space, and people started engaging communities, the models for a long time remained grants from donors. And the challenge I've seen with that is that became the anticipated and expected approach. So when you go to communities, they have a perception that this is free money to help them find a model that benefits them and benefits conservation. So whereas the theory of the explanation is right, the framework of the project is skewed because it's introduced initially just as a grant, and it's part of what Joseph was saying, then becomes a problem, because then you're trying to find how to have enterprises, nature-based enterprises with nature-positive outcomes, but without an enterprise model, really with a grant model. So I think that's one challenge in scaling up, because you've got to have a paradigm shift in how the project is designed. You cannot scale it up in the same design model. You've really got to have entrepreneurs who are convinced and can develop a business framework where their investment is not just high risk, but there's also a possibility of returns. And communities also appreciate that they must invest, whether that investment is land or is land resources or is labor. But I think another component then of scaling up is quantifying the contributory elements that invest into these projects. Because in most cases, projects would try and quantify labor, but that is such a soft, non-tangible input that at the end of the day, it's either very skewed with the investor putting in everything, and the communities haven't really put in a tangible investment. So when we look at the natural capital valuation to ensure that the value of the land, the value of the assets of that land go into the business framework in the scaling up. And I think the third point I would say that's important for scaling up is capacity of the local community to understand, not just to understand, to actually have the capacity to run this as a business, not as a good to do activity with great outcomes. And that's not because they're unwilling. If you look at some of the communities we've been working with, a lot of them are over 70% illiterate in terms of really having gone to formal school. So even if you have an investor coming with a clear business model, how many understand it? So you then create a framework of governance that has people sitting on behalf of the community who know jack what's going on. And so we have had instances where even though the model was well thought out, the community was ripped off in how they played their role because they didn't really understand how best that role ought to be played and what they should expect. And that takes years. That you can't fix overnight. But I think my point is to say that those elements need to be considered and brought into the scaling up thinking. But the potential for scaling up is absolutely there, but some of those become barriers to making it effective.
Lucy, thank you so much for sharing that. Paul, over to you. You've worked with a lot of at the grassroots level through Greenbelt movement. What are some of the mechanisms that you have seen that have been effective in scaling the community-based solutions that Greenbelt movement has?
Thank you. Let me first apologize for the low light. It's going to be a storm here and there are no lights. So
okay.
Very sorry.
No worries.
Yeah. The Greenbelt movement, part of our work involves a lot of trainings and capacity building. But then in the most successful projects like the coffee with the coffee farmers, after the project, you realize every other community, including non-coffee growing zone like the tea zones, want to be engaged, and that creates a challenge in terms of scaling up and moving the project to other areas. But one of our strongest points is that in our elaborate capacity building, which we call the community education and environment, community empowerment and environmental education, that really focuses on the immediate need of the household and what that farmer can do without much support. That he or she can harness the few resources around and can be able to move forward. That has really helped us to scale up into other areas where finances were hindrances. For instance, if you are talking about simple kitchen gardens, the communities can really mobilize the few resources that they have and be able to establish those kitchen gardens, harvest water at their local level without no much support. So I think one of the mechanisms that has really helped us is the way, or is the approach in terms of the trainings that we give. There are a lot of interest in many areas where we have done these trainings, including in Tororo, Uganda, where even without any financial support, these communities went ahead and did marvelous small initiatives that really add up to the family economy and to improve livelihoods of the communities. And again, also looking at conservation. For instance, if you are training them on simple farm systems, simple farming systems, including growing of cover crops, indigenous crops, growing, harvesting water at the local level. These are things that that really doesn't require them to look for funding, but they are able to move forward even without much support. So in areas where we are unable to go due to financial constraints, that training really helps. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. That was really helpful to understand. Which brings us to our next question, and I will pose this to Justin. Joseph. Joseph, you've worked with a lot of enterprises as part of your portfolio. I know they talk about, giving capital support, but what are other kinds of support, the non-financial business support that these enterprises need? If you could highlight one or two key areas of support that these enterprises need.
Yeah, very briefly. I mean, they need support often across the board, but the two fundamental ones are governance and financial skills, right? Ultimately, the people tend to get very confused with accounting, with reporting, and if you don't manage your cash flows, you're really, really likely to get in trouble sooner rather than later. So, growing a business and managing capital is as soon as you get to a certain size, that becomes a challenge. So a lot of the companies we work with, or we have worked with historically, needed support. And I'm not talking about little startups in the middle of nowhere. I'm talking sometimes about companies that may have turnovers of $5-10 million. They still have relatively unsophisticated reporting systems and governance systems, and they need support. Understanding the difference between people's, the owner of the company's personal finances and the company finances, and then managing decision making, particularly when they have partners and shareholders or lenders on board.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Esther, over to you as the managing director of a social enterprise. What are some of the areas that you see businesses like yourself need support in other than financial support?
There's one of the panelists that mentioned something to do with land rights. And because we are working with communities that have to utilize land, in certain instances where land rights are an issue, it really complicates matters for us. So because there's no clear pathway to solving land rights issues, it can get very complicated. Perfect example is where a lady signs up to plant trees and the husband doesn't like the idea, and they don't own the land, there's no title deed, it's family land, and they don't agree. And so eventually the lady will end up being disenfranchised, especially in the case that it becomes a polygamous issue. There's someone else that comes into the picture. We have a lot of those issues, especially for the ladies. They suffer that quite a bit, or you're sent back home and you worked very hard, planted all of these trees, and then you don't get to benefit. So land rights and land rights related issues are quite a big one for us. As we move out of the southern part of Kenya, we see improvement in that, because in the central regions, that's not a major problem, but down at the coast, that can be quite a big problem. So that for me is, if there's one thing I would want solved overnight, would be that people get their title deeds and they have very clear land rights use, because currently we have to work with what we simply term as a statement of land ownership, which in the event of disputes, it's not necessarily very enforceable legally. So you're left holding assets on land that's not very clear. So that's for me a major issue.
Thank you for sharing that, Esther. Jeff, over to you. Based on your experience of working with different interventions, what do you see are areas of non-financial business support that some of these community solutions need?
Great, thank you very much. And it's really interesting to hear the other panelists. I think just building on what you're saying, Esther, to me, there's also a range of legal support that's required, whether it's around tenure issues, but also around agreements and negotiations, particularly critical in communal land right or communal resource management situations, which of course are absolutely essential for conservation achievements as well. We can do conservation at individual scale, where we have clear land tenure, but we also can have very effective models for doing it across a kind of more of an open tenure community situation. But that requires good legal guidance and good legal frameworks, especially when negotiating with potential business partners as well. I think other areas would be around things like accessing markets. How do we actually develop product and ensure we've got product quality? How do we identify key markets for and new opportunities. Again, Paul mentioned this around coffee. I mean, there are efforts in Kenya and in various places in the north and the south as well about conservation beef, and how do we actually identify this, and how do we market our products in a way that we can get real value for them. I think obviously there's huge amounts of innovation within communities at the local scale, and how do you then translate that and engage with these larger markets? Joseph mentioned the financial management, and there's also areas around proposal and business development planning. How do we actually write good business plans, and how do we actually communicate our ideas effectively so that we can get support at the community level? We recently worked with the Luke Hoffman Institute and the African Leadership University on an innovation challenge around beyond tourism and the effects of COVID, as was mentioned earlier. How do we develop new innovative approaches for bringing finance and money and income streams for conservation with local communities? And one of the clear challenges, of course, is how do you get proposals from local communities? How can we strengthen the ability of local communities to compete in these sorts of environments through clear business planning and proposal development, for example?
Thank you for sharing that. Paul, over to you. Based on your experience, what do you see are some of the other areas of support that are needed for community-based solutions here? So Paul did mention he was having issues because of the storm. Are you still here, Paul?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, great.
Yes. Thank you. Like I said, our communities are really on the grassroots, and in most cases, these communities depend wholly on the immediate natural resources like the forests and the land that they use for their households for sustenance. And a lot of the time, these are communities with very low income levels. But again, with a lot of experience and indigenous knowledge in terms of managing some of these resources. One of the greatest support with these communities that we have employed is trying to bring them into community groups, into formal groups where they are able even to negotiate with other actors, including financial institutions, because we have communities, farmer associations where through their structures, they are able to access banking facilities. And again, working with us, we are able to support them to get financial aid even from government, local government agencies, like the county funds. So basically, when we organize them in a way that they are able to present themselves as a group and as a community, they're able to be supported by other actors in their locality.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Paul. So my next question is to Jeff. Jeff, you've looked at, worked across different programs. If you could highlight some of the best metrics that can be used to showcase the impact created by livelihood-based initiatives. And what are the challenges related to measurement here?
Well, thank you very much. I think this is a really important, critical, and challenging question, actually. I mean, how do we measure this? And what are our real targets? I mean, at the simplest level, we can talk about sort of income generation, but I think there's a lot of other ways that we can look at this, and we need to look at this. And I think that, as was raised earlier, there's also the scale of impact. Is it immediate? Is it immediate returns on investment? Or are there longer term impacts? And obviously, in the short term, we can see changes in income levels within communities. We can see changes in food security. We can start to see educational outcomes. In the longer term, we're starting to look at things like adaptation and resilience and this long-term sustainability of production. But how do we measure those, and how do we measure those effectively? That is challenging, and it's costly. And I think in the business community, we recognize the importance of information and data for making decisions. In the conservation community, we do as well, but we don't necessarily bring those things effectively together. And I think that's one of the real challenges for us: is how do we work to identify clear metrics that we can all agree on, and what success looks like, and then how do we actually consistently collect this data and do that over the long term? Because conservation and sustainability and livelihoods. These are long-term questions. These are not short-term challenges. And when we talk about preserving carbon, or we talk about enhancing river flows, we need to be doing that and investing on multi-decade time horizons. It's very different from many other aspects. So how do we bring that together? I mean, so at WWF we have a lot of experience, as other conservation organizations do, in collecting metrics about conservation. We less experience, but a growing experience in how we do that, and collecting information about livelihoods. And I think it's also critical here to work closely either with our business partners or with our other partners that are helping us to implement in some of these landscapes. There are other CSOs and NGO actors who are in this more traditional sort of development and livelihood space, and we need to work closely together to bring our metrics together so we can get a full picture of the impacts of these particular efforts at the scale of household, at the scale of landscape, and then ultimately nationally and regionally.
Thank you for sharing that, Jeff. Esther, over to you. As an entrepreneur, you do have to, you are looking at what is the impact that's created by your programs. What are the challenges related to measurement there?
I think, like has just been said, there are so many methods of trying to measure social impact, but some of the most effective ones also are very long term. You'd have to kind of track the lives of the people you're working with over a long period of time to actually be able to measure impact beyond just income generation and more money in their pocket with what you've done with them. But I think overall, what's important is just the kind of, even from a conservation perspective, the kind of feedback you get over time being in an area. And I would like to use an example to describe that. For the last 10 years in Kilifi, nobody was saying nothing about our activities there. Then all of a sudden, in a few years ago, people started noticing that there was activity happening. There was more shops, there was more trading, there was a lot of more activity going on because of the trickle-down effect of money that's flowing in that circular economy. And ultimately, we had the Ministry of Environment saying, hey, wait a minute, we've seen from our remote sensing images that there's this whole new forest cover, and they start getting interest into what exactly is going on there. So there are so many things to measure, and there's a lot of trickle-down effects. But basically, the easiest and simplest for us has been around, enrollment in schools, the literacy levels going up, business acumen increasing in the areas we are in because there's activity and there's money flowing in the economy and things like those. But it requires a lot more than, looking at, this study or that study. It's a very different pronged approach. There's so many ways you could look at it and say, we think we've had impact in the community.
Thank you for sharing that, Esther. Joseph, over to you. You've been an investor in conservation enterprises. I know you've looked at various different enterprises, and of course, the impact metrics would differ across these enterprises. What is your take? What are the challenges related to measurement with your work?
The challenges are manifold. It's a nightmare measuring impact, and I'll give you an example. If you're successful at saving a charismatic species like elephants, you're likely to see a massive reduction in tree covers. So there you go. Which one is more important? So that's just one sort of cherry-picked example. I just want to, I think you can do it. Luckily, as Esther mentioned, there's a component of remote sensing and the use of technology to have much more scale. I know WWF is very involved in programs like that. IUCN has now published sort of a catalog of ecosystems, and there's a number of initiatives that are trying to help people like us understand how our businesses are impacting positively and negatively. Well, we mustn't forget the environment without having to break the bank to do it, because measuring impact is expensive, and that's a role for grant financing, by the way, is helping us learn lessons. And we have to be humble enough to look at an investment and say, you know what, this didn't work out well. We got it wrong. We shouldn't invest in this kind of businesses, because you might be helping some outcomes at the expense of some other more important outcomes. You might help some agricultural livelihoods that then suddenly turn into massive deforestation and land degradation. And that would be a failure from our perspective. Might be a great success from somebody who's just focusing on people's monthly incomes in the short term. Now, I just wanted to make a slightly contrarian comment, perhaps contrarian, maybe not, but it's about just making sure that we distinguish between the long-term nature of the impact we want to reach, and the activities in and around important ecosystems and natural capital assets, and not necessarily having to marry them to long-term nature of capital, right? Citibank has been around for quite a few decades, and so has Microsoft nowadays, and so have many other enterprises, right? Some of them have been for over a century, and they've had short-term capital, right? And sometimes the businesses go bankrupt, but the industry remains, right? We cannot mix the two. Some businesses just have a natural cycle, and they will move on or be replaced by more efficient uses of enterprise activity or by newer technologies. I think we don't need to necessarily marry all economic activity around conservation areas to the long-term nature of conservation. We just need to be very conscious that when you allocate shorter capital, you may have some perverse effects in needing short-term returns. So you need to make sure that you don't steer the boat towards the rocks, basically.
Thank you, Joseph. It's a pretty important point. I would now like to ask Lucy to comment upon this. Lucy, your organization has been working on conservation research for a while, and what is your take here? Are there challenges to measurement? Are there simple ways to measure impact that's being created by conservation and livelihoods here?
So one of the things we have done, we have always had a long-term monitoring view to the projects we implement. One, we've benefited from an ecological perspective, long-term monitoring that's done by one of our affiliates, the Amboseli Conservation Program, led by Dr. Weston, that has monitored the ecology for almost 50 years. So in the sites where we work, which overlap with the sites that they monitor, we are able to at least assess from an ecological perspective what's changing, and perhaps to some extent attribute why it's changing. I think the reality is, by the time you see impact on the ground, most cases it's not the effort of just one entity. So it would be also erroneous for me to say that all positive impact is because of our intervention. I think our monitoring approach is to look at, is the land, out of the combined measures, both ours and others, is the environment improving? But then at the more micro scale, where we have enterprises, we undertake household surveys as a baseline before the project starts. When possible, if the project is long enough, in the middle, halfway, and then at the end of the project. And we look at several things. One will be attitudes, because we believe that changing attitudes does have a big impact on changing habits and actions in the long term. So we do assess our community's attitudes changing. If they thought wildlife was a threat and a disturbance to them, has the projects they've been involved in changed that attitude to see that as a benefit? So we also measure household incomes and to what extent they're getting more income or not, and be able to evaluate over the project period. Again, this is for the micro level. And we also evaluate their sort of long-term anticipation and expectation, because there'll always be people hoping they made more, hoping the project would make them more than it did. But at least you get a sense of, are they where they were when we started, or do they sense that this has brought a greater value? And in the projects with the women, where we were restoring over hundreds of acres in plots in 100-acre enclosures. Some are 60 acres, some are 100, but more recently we've gone into bigger ones like 10 by 10 kilometer. Some were able to record sales of baled grass in thousands of shillings per season. I mean, hundreds of thousands of shillings in a year over the 2 seasons. And also sale of grass seeds, as more people wanted to plant grass seeds as a restoration intervention. the women we supported were able to sell the grass seeds that they harvested from the restoration project we implemented. So they were able to see the double value of not only the restoration value of fodder available for their cattle, but that from a business perspective, they're able to sell what is excess and that they're not using. And so being able also then to quantify the monetary gain of the specific intervention. So we have monitoring tools we've been using over time. We've modified them into open data smartphone toolkits so that every the local resource assessors that we hire can collect it remotely. It goes to the cloud and basic results on graphs. We measure milk yields. Are the cows that go in producing more coming into these restored pastures milk, or are they and compared to areas that don't have pastures that are restored? So we do collect those kind of metrics. I think the one challenge is the effectiveness of feeding back the outcomes of the monitoring back to the community, because that's an important part of research, and it's still something we're working on improving, but it helps them to see what results are we finding, and not only validating that with them, but also trying to see what will they do with the information they get from the monitoring work.
Thank you so much, Lucy, for sharing that. We do have a lot of questions coming in now, so I am going to open it up for Q&A. Thank you for being amazing panelists today. We will start taking questions now and continuing this discussion. So the first question is to Joseph. Considering the effect of COVID on wildlife tourism for the next period and the lack of income for national parks, and also lodge and conservation programs, I'm wondering if carbon offset will become more a reliable source of financing for conservation projects rather than tourism. What is your opinion here?
My opinion is that, well, it's twofold. One is that I wouldn't panic about tourism. Maybe I'm biased. I'm originally from Barcelona, which is a part of the world that has seen enormous development from tourism. Barcelona receives something like 3 times its number of inhabitants in the form of tourists every year. So they've created enormous amounts of wealth. Imagine if Kenya had sort of 100 million tourists. Well, not as many, but in any case, what we have in tourism is a hiatus that it's caused by a very abnormal circumstance. It's going to hurt a lot of tourism businesses in a lot of conservation areas, and it highlights a problem which carbon addresses, but some of the initiatives that Lucy was describing address as well. Is you need income diversification. You need to not be dependent, not have all your eggs in one basket, and that can come from agroforestry, that can come from sustainable livestock management, it can come from a number of other things. Carbon is a fantastic tool. And I think it will play an increasing valuable role in the future, but it's expensive to develop as a tool. You need scale. You cannot have a viable carbon project on 100 hectares or even 5,000 hectares. You have to have hundreds of thousands before it actually makes economic sense. And prices are looking promising, but it's going to be another volatile commodity, I would expect, in the long term. And potentially, as companies really start walking their talk towards net zero, we will have a different problem. Maybe it won't be myself, but it will be younger people in my firm, where the prices start going down because the demand for carbon offsets goes down. So carbon is a great tool. I think people should consider it. I think we're very bullish on this market. We think it's just the beginning. I'm very hopeful that in the next decade we'll see water offsets or water credits. We'll see biodiversity credits, right? You need a special type of ecosystem to sustain lions or to sustain elephants. An acre of tropical land in Borneo holds a lot of biodiversity, but it couldn't hold an elephant. You need hundreds of thousands of acres for a viable elephant population. So all those components, the market will find a way to price. I think what we need to do is diversify income streams, and these financial instruments are very exciting.
Thank you, Joseph. Our next question is, does the sector attract youth participation for these employment initiatives? Lucy, would you like to take that? Absolutely,
yes. Not yes that I'd like to take the question, but yes, there are employment opportunities. In ACC, one of the program I just mentioned on monitoring, we hire community youth to do the monitoring. We call them community resource assessors. And in fact, when we worked with Jeff many years ago, he helped set up that program for us. And even though it doesn't pay much, it pays to youth who would otherwise have no jobs. And it helps them be part of the people who are creating the knowledge on their own environment, measuring what the impact of what actions they're taking and actions we're taking have. So they're going to the markets and looking at market prices. They're measuring milk yields. They're looking at grass condition, habitat quality. And it also improves their capacity to deal with terms that would otherwise be the domain of master's and PhD students, but downscaled to language and tools that they can use and understand and become the champions of explaining what they're finding back to their own community. So we really believe that the young people being part of this research is a space for Africa, because in the past, 40, 50 years ago, research was people flying in to do it. And now we have local universities, but most people come out of there and want a job in an office. But we have many local youth who are not getting jobs. So finding them jobs on the land, I think has great opportunity. And the more we can see many of them gaining interest in this, the more they can start bridging the gap. We've been talking about financial literacy capacity, lack of capacity rather, within the older people who own the land. But if the younger people come on board, I think they'll be able to move these businesses further, because they do already have much more understanding than their parents do. So I think the space is ripe. I don't think it's hiring enough people yet. When you think of community scouts, most of them, the rangers, are young people, but I think there's still a lot of scope of engaging them more.
Thank you. So our next question is for Jeff. Jeff, what can be done to ensure government participates in such programs and with an aim to enhance sustainability?
Shraddha, repeat again, please. I missed the first half of that.
Sure. So the question is, what can be done to ensure that the government participates in such programs with an aim to enhance sustainability?
I think it's a really good question. I think this is, one of the key partners and key elements here. And again, Giuseppe mentioned it at the very beginning about natural capital and accounting for these effectively. I think if we really truly recognize the importance of natural capital across all of our industries, whether it's food production in pastoral areas or in crop growing areas, whether it's energy production in many places in terms of hydropower, whether it's water for our cities and our burgeoning urban economies and industries, it's really very, very critical. And I think COVID has really highlighted the importance of that of our natural resources to our basic development. Whether it's people leaving urban areas to go back and farm in response to collapsing industries and loss of jobs, or in the context of the green recovery, and how can we actually ensure that we are investing as governments to ensure that these natural assets are preserved. I think, linking with your previous question around youth, I mean, one wonders whether there's an opportunity for some large-scale, massive investment in restoration, which can provide employment and opportunities for large numbers of people as we restore some of our degraded ecosystems, the rangelands in East Africa being a primary example. And how can we bring investment and bring opportunities to people in the short term, but then rebuild the foundation of our natural capital that will enable us to move forward with these sustainable industries.
Thank you so much, Jeff. So our next question, I would pose it to both Esther and Paul. Paul, would you like to go first? The question is, what is the gender participation in such initiatives?
For us as a Greenbelt movement, women are at the core of our activities. Like I said, the 4,000 community groups that we work with across the 5 watershed and even beyond, 70% of them are women. We are working with women groups from the village level, youth groups in a mixed setup, but 70% comprises of women. And this is solely because the issues that we are dealing with, when you talk about lack of water, lack of fuel, lack of food at the table, these are things that resonate with women. Those challenges are really felt by women at the grassroots level. And therefore, when we address these challenges through women, they're able to take up, because essentially we are solving their problems, and in general, solving the community problem. And therefore, again, it's very easy for women to take up these initiatives because inherently, I think they also possess some experience and knowledge in terms of managing these resources. This has not been really appreciated in many areas, but we do believe in women are great natural resource managers because they interact with the natural resources on a daily basis. And therefore, for us, it's deliberate. When we go to women way back when Professor Ongari Maathai started the Green Belt movement, she went to the women and interrogated them. What are the challenges at your household? And they mentioned water, they mentioned food, they mentioned fuel. And these are still relevant issues even today. If you look at the climate change now and the challenges that it possesses, the greatest victims are still women. Men can move from those areas if the crop is not good, they can move into towns, but women remain in the villages with the children. And therefore, our main focus still remains women. But again, we do engage women. I mean, we do engage men in many areas because in most cases, women do not have the rights to access and even to control some of these resources, including land. And therefore, we do involve men so that they also understand why it's very necessary to involve women in some of this decision making. In the forest, if you do an inventory, a head count at the gate of the forest, more women leave the forest than men with firewood, with forest products than men. And therefore, our focus still remains women because we know at the end of the day, we are solving a community problem and even beyond. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Paul. Esther, would you like to respond to that? What is the gender participation for Kumasa forestry?
Yeah, for us, unfortunately, we're not as gender balanced as police because of the issue I mentioned earlier on the land. So we are looking at 54% men and 46% women, which is not bad. It's not that bad, but mostly the real people that work on the project is really the women. So if you were to look at from the perspective of who really provides the labor, the civil catch activities that have to be carried out, it's really mostly the women that are breaking their backs in the field. But because of the nature of land ownership, again, you mostly find that the people that signed up are actually men because men had to give permission to their wives to sign up for the project. So we have to, it's what it is. So, so it's culturally the context we are operating in, and very little we can do around that. And we are working with what we currently have.
Thank you for sharing that. So I think this one is more for Lucy. Lucy, we have a question that says, has anyone experienced hostility from the community while trying to pilot projects?
We have not experienced hostility in the sense of people not wanting us to be there, because if your project is addressing a felt need around the lines, especially that I think it was Joseph or Paul, who mentioned about water, food, and fuel. People want to be able to feed their families and get their families to progress. So if your project is helping them address their personal needs, then that's always welcome. I think that hostility may come if you've been there before, started something that either didn't work or you didn't give them, they didn't get their end of the bargain, then they may not trust you if you're coming a second time with a different project or a similar promise. So I think sometimes hostility is experienced when communities have fatigue of people promising, maybe projects that don't come to fruition as they expected, or sometimes, especially with surveys, and I must say that because it comes up with monitoring and this kind of surveys we want to do, they get fatigued because there'll be this group coming to survey them coming from a water sector, a conservation group wants to survey the same household, someone starting a leather industry wants to survey the same household. So one has to be sensitive to think about, is this something I really must do in this fashion? Or is there a more inclusive way to make them part of not only what you want to know, but also we like thinking of it as co-designing. Can they be part of what you're trying to design, as opposed to just feeling as a recipient of your agenda? So there is those sensitivities that one needs to be aware of.
Thank you so much. Right. So, Lucy, one more question to you. Based on the initiatives that you were working with, did you see a bias where there were more women versus men in terms of participation?
Exactly like Esther. When you deal with land matters, it's 99.9% men, and they'll put a token woman because you insist there needs to be some gender balance. However, the enterprises that have succeeded have been the ones with women, hands down, all the time. And that's why when we went the model of the milk cooperative, that cooperative is 100% women, because the cows belong to the men, but the milk belongs to the women. So the men had no objection to have a cooperative of milk for women alone. But if you're talking land or talking cattle, then you need to engage the men. And once you do, then a lot of politics does come into play. But so our evidence on the ground is that our successful enterprises have been those largely led and owned by women.
Right. Thank you so much for sharing that. We're almost at time, so I will just see if there are quickly any more questions where anyone would like to make any closing remarks. Otherwise, we will start wrapping up the session. So to everyone who attended the session today, thank you so much. It was wonderful having you here. To all our panelists, it was an engaging discussion. We got to hear perspectives from various stakeholders. We had an investor, an entrepreneur, an implementer, a researcher, an impact specialist. So it really gave us a very good discussion on what is actually happening when it comes to conservation and livelihoods in Africa, and what is the way forward, what are the bottlenecks, and what can be done to scale these programs further. So personally for me, there were quite a few interesting takeaways, especially on the land rights, how gender plays a role, and what are the financing mechanisms that will actually work. So thank you so much for your time, and I hope you all enjoy the rest of the summit.